Before Rome ruled the world, it was just a river, a few hills, and a handful of struggling communities. Over more than 2,000 years, that fragile beginning turned into an empire that shaped law, power, war, religion, and everyday life across 3 continents. In this documentary, we trace the entire history of Rome, from its shadowy origins before written records, through kings, republic, conquest, civil war, and empire, to its slow transformation and long decline. This is not a story of constant glory nor a simple fall. It is a human story of ambition, survival, mistakes, and adaptation. By following Rome step by step, we see how one city changed the world and why its legacy still surrounds us today. Chapter 1: Rome. Before Rome. Long before Rome was a name written in history books, the land itself was already shaping what would come next. The story begins not with emperors or armies, but with a river. The Tiber River flowed slowly through central Italy, cutting a natural path between the mountains and the sea. It flooded often, leaving behind rich soil, but it was also shallow enough to cross at certain points. That simple balance made the area valuable. People could farm here, trade here, and move through here. Long before Rome existed, others had already noticed. Around the river rose a series of low hills. They were not dramatic peaks, but they offered safety. From the hilltops, early settlers could see movement along the river and defend themselves if needed. Archaeology shows that by around 1000 BC, small communities were already living on these hills. They left behind traces of huts, tools, and burial sites. These were not city builders yet. They were farmers and herders, living close to the land, moving with the seasons, and slowly learning which places worked and which did not. The people who lived here belonged to a wider group known as the Latins. They spoke related languages, shared similar customs, and lived in scattered villages across the region called Latium. Life was simple but not easy. Farming depended on rainfall. Livestock could be lost to disease or raids. Survival required cooperation, and over time, nearby villages began to interact more closely. Paths between settlements became regular routes. Small markets formed. What started as separate communities slowly began to overlap. Trade played a quiet but important role. The Tiber connected inland villages to the Mediterranean world. Goods moved along the river. Salt from the coast, grain from the interior, metal tools from distant regions. This movement brought ideas as well as objects. New farming methods appeared, weapons improved, social differences became clearer as some families gained more land and influence than others. To the north lived the Etruscans, a powerful and advanced culture compared to the small Latin villages. They built planned cities, used stone architecture, and had strong trade links across the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows that Etruscan goods, art styles, and religious practices reached the settlements around the Tiber. This was not a sudden takeover, but a gradual influence. Local leaders learned from Etruscan models of power and organization. Over time, these ideas helped transform loose villages into something more structured. Much later, Roman writers would tell the story differently. They spoke of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a wolf, destined to found a great city. It is a powerful story, but archaeology tells a quieter truth. There is no evidence of a single founding moment or a single founder. Instead, Rome emerged slowly as villages on neighboring hills merged over generations. The myth was never meant to be a record. It was meant to explain identity. By giving Rome a dramatic birth story, later Romans gave meaning to their past and authority to their present. That does not mean the myths are useless. They reveal what Romans valued. Strength, struggle, family, and conflict appear again and again. Even the story of Romulus killing Remus reflects a deep Roman belief that order sometimes comes through violence. These stories helped later Romans understand who they were, even if they did not describe events exactly as they happened. Archaeology fills in the gaps where stories fade. Excavations on the Palatine Hill show continuous settlement, from simple huts to more permanent homes. Burial practices changed over time, showing growing social differences. Weapons found in graves suggest that conflict was common. This was not a peaceful world. Communities competed for land, water, and trade access. Defense mattered, and so did leadership. Agriculture was at the center of everything. Grain farming supported larger populations, but it required coordination. Fields had to be managed. Storage had to be planned. As food production became more reliable, populations grew. More people meant more pressure, but also more labor. Slowly, the conditions for urban life appeared. By the 8th century BC, the villages around the Tiber were no longer isolated. Shared spaces emerged. Religious sites brought people together. Common burial grounds replaced family plots. These changes point to a growing sense of unity. Not a city yet, but something moving in that direction. What matters most is that Rome was not an accident. It did not rise because of fate alone or a single heroic figure. It grew because the land allowed it, because people adapted, and because outside influences pushed local communities to organize in new ways. Rome was shaped by geography, migration, trade, and conflict long before it ruled anyone. By the time later Romans looked back and named a founding year, the real foundation had already been laid over centuries. The hills were occupied, the river was controlled, the people were connected. Rome existed in pieces before it existed as an idea. Chapter 2. The Age of Kings. Rome did not begin as a republic. Before senates, elections, and written laws, the city was ruled by kings. This period, remembered as the Age of Kings, sits in a strange space between myth and history. Ancient writers give us names, stories, and dates, but archaeology forces us to slow down and separate what can be confirmed from what was shaped later to explain Roman identity. According to tradition, Rome was ruled by 7 kings, starting in 753 BC and ending in 509 BC. The list includes figures like Romulus, Numa Pompilius, and Tarquin the Proud. Roman historians such as Livy wrote about them centuries later, relying on oral tradition, family records, and political memory. That distance matters. These stories were not neutral. They were shaped by a republic that deeply distrusted kings and wanted to explain why monarchy had failed. What archaeology does confirm is that during this period, Rome changed dramatically. The scattered hilltop villages began to merge into a single urban community. Wooden huts gave way to stone foundations. Public spaces appeared. Drainage systems were built, including early versions of what would become the Cloaca Maxima, a massive sewer that turned swampy land into usable ground. These were not the actions of simple village chiefs. They point to centralized authority and organized labor. The kings were not absolute rulers in the way later emperors would be. Power was shared, at least in part, with elite families and councils of elders. The king served as a military leader, chief judge, and high priest. Religion and politics were deeply connected. Decisions were justified through rituals, omens, and divine approval. This was common across the ancient world, and Rome was no exception. One of the most important influences during this time came from the north. The Etruscans were at the height of their power, and evidence suggests that some of Rome's later kings were either Etruscan or heavily influenced by Etruscan culture. Archaeology shows clear changes in architecture, clothing, symbols of authority, and religious practices. The use of stone temples, ceremonial objects, and formal city planning all reflect this influence. This was also the period when Rome began to think of itself as a city rather than a cluster of settlements. Defensive walls were constructed, roads were laid out, public gathering spaces became central to social life. These developments required planning, taxation, and enforcement. Whether ruled by one king or several powerful families, Rome was learning how to govern complexity. The stories of individual kings often reflect what Romans later believed good or bad leadership looked like. Romulus appears as a warrior founder. Numa is remembered as a peaceful lawgiver who organized religious life. Servius Tullius is credited with early social reforms and census systems. These stories may exaggerate individual roles, but they point to real changes taking place over generations. The final kings, especially Tarquin the Proud, are described very differently. Roman sources portray him as cruel, arrogant, and dismissive of traditional checks on power. Whether this portrait is fully accurate is debated, but it reflects a genuine shift. By the late 6th century BC, Rome had grown larger, wealthier, and more socially divided. Tensions between elite families and common citizens increased. Absolute rule became harder to accept. The fall of the monarchy is traditionally linked to a scandal involving royal abuse of power. Again, the details are likely shaped by later moral storytelling. What matters more is the outcome. Rome rejected kingship entirely. The word rex became associated with tyranny. Political power was redistributed into shared offices with limited terms. This was a radical decision, and it defined Roman political culture for centuries. Archaeological layers from this period show both growth and disruption. Building projects stop and start. Burials change. This suggests instability, not a clean break. The transition from monarchy to republic was likely messy, contested, and gradual. But it worked. Rome did not collapse. Instead, it adapted. The Age of Kings left Rome with essential tools. Urban infrastructure, religious institutions, legal customs, and ideas about leadership all took shape here. Even after kings were gone, their legacy remained embedded in Roman life. Later officials continued to perform royal rituals. Religious offices outlived political ones. The memory of kings became a warning, not a model. By the time the monarchy ended, Rome was no longer just surviving. It was ready to expand, to organize power differently, and to test a new idea, that no single person should rule forever. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Republic. When Rome removed its kings, it did not replace them with peace. It replaced them with uncertainty. The early republic was not born from careful planning, but from fear. Fear of tyranny, fear of one man holding too much power, and fear that the city could slide back into monarchy. What followed was not a clean system, but an ongoing experiment that took generations to stabilize. Around 509 BC, Rome declared itself a republic. The idea was simple on the surface: no kings, shared power, limited terms. In practice, it was far more complicated. Authority that once rested in a single ruler was split between multiple offices. At the top were two consuls, elected yearly, each able to block the other's decisions. This was meant to prevent abuse, but it also created rivalry and gridlock. Power was no longer clear, and that tension would define the republic from its first days. Alongside the consuls stood the Senate, a body made up of elite men from powerful families. The Senate did not technically pass laws, but it controlled money, foreign policy, and long-term strategy. Its influence was enormous. Most senators came from the patrician class, families who claimed noble ancestry and long-standing authority. Below them were the plebeians, the majority of Rome's population, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, and laborers who carried much of the burden but had little voice. This imbalance created immediate conflict. The Republic may have rejected kings, but it did not reject inequality. Political rights were limited. Legal protections were unclear. Debt was a crushing problem for common citizens, especially soldiers who returned from war to find their farms damaged or seized. These pressures did not remain quiet for long. One of the most important struggles of early Republican history is known as the Conflict of the Orders. It was not a single event, but a long series of protests, negotiations, and reforms that lasted over 2 centuries. At times, plebeians withdrew from the city entirely, refusing to work or fight. Rome depended on them, and their absence forced compromise. Step by step, they gained new rights. One major turning point was the creation of the office of tribune. Tribunes were elected by the plebeians and had the power to block decisions they believed harmed the people. This veto power was revolutionary. For the first time, common citizens had a formal defense against elite control. The tribunes were considered sacred. Harming one was a serious crime. This gave the office real force, even when facing the Senate. Law itself also changed. Early Roman law was unwritten and controlled by elites, which allowed abuse and manipulation. In response, Rome created its first written legal code, known as the 12 Tables. Displayed publicly, these laws did not create equality, but they created clarity. Citizens could now know their rights and obligations. Justice became more predictable, even if it was still unequal. Military service played a central role in all of this. The Republic relied on citizen soldiers. Men who fought expected a voice in the state they defended. As Rome expanded its territory, military demands increased. This made political exclusion harder to justify. Over time, service and citizenship became deeply linked, pushing Rome toward broader participation. The Republic's political system grew more complex as new offices were added. Praetors handled legal matters. Quaestors managed finances. Censors oversaw public morals and recorded citizens. Each role had limits. Each came with checks. This layered system slowed decision-making, but it also prevented sudden concentration of power. Still, instability never disappeared. Elections were competitive and often corrupt. Alliances shifted. Powerful families dominated offices across generations. The Republic functioned, but it was always under strain. What made it remarkable was not that it avoided crisis, but that it survived so many. Religion continued to shape politics. Priests interpreted omens. Religious calendars controlled when assemblies could meet. This allowed tradition to influence power in subtle ways. Politics was never separate from belief. Romans accepted this as normal. By the 4th century BC, Rome was no longer just defending itself. It was expanding across Italy. This expansion tested the Republic system. Conquered peoples were not all treated the same. Some gained partial citizenship. Others became allies bound by military obligation. Rome built a network of control that relied on cooperation as much as force. What emerged from these early centuries was a political culture built on compromise, tension, and constant negotiation. The Republic did not promise fairness. It promised balance. And for a time, that balance worked. But success brought new challenges. As Rome grew richer and more powerful, the system that had once protected it would begin to show cracks. The very structure designed to prevent tyranny would one day struggle to control ambition. Chapter 4. Conquest of Italy. Rome's rise across Italy did not happen in a single rush of conquest. It unfolded slowly, shaped by geography, necessity, and repeated trial and error. By the early 4th century BC, the Roman Republic was strong enough to look beyond its immediate neighbors, but not yet powerful enough to dominate them easily. What followed was a long period of conflict and negotiation that would turn Rome from a regional city-state into the leading power of the Italian peninsula. At the center of this expansion was Rome's location. From its position near the middle of Italy, the city could move north toward the Etruscan lands or south toward the fertile plains and Greek-influenced cities of the coast. The network of rivers and valleys worked in Rome's favor, allowing armies to travel and supplies to follow. But geography also created enemies. Italy was not empty land. It was crowded with independent peoples, each defending their own territory, traditions, and survival. One of Rome's earliest challenges came from neighboring Latin cities. These communities shared language and customs with Rome, but that familiarity did not guarantee peace. Competition for land and influence led to repeated clashes. Over time, Rome offered a new kind of solution. Instead of destroying defeated cities, it often absorbed them into a wider system. Some were granted partial citizenship. Others became allies, required to provide soldiers, but allowed to govern themselves locally. This flexible approach reduced rebellion and increased manpower. Military adaptation played a key role. Early Roman armies had been modeled on Greek-style formations, effective on flat ground, but limited in rough terrain. As Rome fought inland peoples in hills and mountains, it was forced to change. The Manipular Legion emerged, a more flexible formation that allowed smaller units to move independently. This made Roman armies better suited to the varied landscapes of Italy and more resilient in battle. Among Rome's most serious rivals were the Samnites, powerful communities living in the central Apennine Mountains. The Samnite Wars stretched over decades and were marked by shifting fortunes. Rome suffered humiliating defeats, including one famous incident where an entire army was trapped and forced to surrender without a fight. These losses mattered. They forced Rome to rethink strategy, leadership, and logistics. Instead of breaking the Republic, defeat strengthened it. Rome learned to build roads not just for trade, but for war. Early versions of long military roads allowed armies to move quickly and reliably. Fortified colonies were planted in strategic locations, acting as both defense and control points. Each road and colony tightened Rome's grip on the land. Expansion was no longer temporary, it became permanent. Southern Italy posed a different challenge. Many cities there had strong Greek cultural ties and long histories of independence. When one of these cities sought help from Pyrrhus, a Greek king with experience fighting the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, Rome faced a new level of warfare. Pyrrhus brought war elephants and professional soldiers. He won battles, but at great cost. These Pyrrhic victories drained his resources faster than Rome's. Rome could lose men and replace them. Pyrrhus could not. This conflict revealed something important. Rome's strength did not come from brilliance in any single battle. It came from endurance. The Republic could mobilize large numbers of citizen soldiers year after year. Allied communities were bound by treaties that required military support. Rome had built a system where defeat did not mean collapse. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome controlled most of Italy either directly or through alliances. This control was not uniform. Some communities enjoyed broad rights. Others lived under strict obligations, but all were tied into Rome's military network. Italy had become a shared battlefield and increasingly a shared political space. Culturally, this expansion reshaped Rome itself. Exposure to Greek art, religion, and ideas influenced Roman education and architecture. Local Italian traditions blended into Roman customs. The Republic did not erase diversity, it absorbed it. Over time, Roman became a political identity more than an ethnic one. The cost of conquest was high. Small farmers were often away at war for long periods. Some lost their land. Wealth flowed into Rome, but not evenly. These pressures would matter later. For now, success overshadowed the warning signs. By conquering Italy, Rome gained something more valuable than territory. It gained experience. It learned how to fight prolonged wars, how to manage allies, and how to recover from failure. These lessons would soon be tested on a much larger stage. Chapter 5: Rome versus Carthage. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome had secured Italy, but it had also reached the edge of something far larger. Beyond the Italian peninsula lay the Western Mediterranean, a space dominated not by Rome, but by another power entirely. That power was Carthage, a wealthy city-state built on trade, sea power, and centuries of experience moving goods and armies across water. Rome and Carthage had coexisted for years without direct conflict, but their interests were drifting toward the same ground. War was not planned. It became unavoidable. The first point of collision was Sicily. The island sat at the center of Mediterranean trade routes and had long been contested by Greek cities and Carthaginian forces. When local disputes drew Rome into Sicilian politics, the Republic crossed a line it had never crossed before. Rome had been a land power. Sicily forced it to fight overseas. That meant confronting Carthage on its strongest ground, the sea. The First Punic War began in 264 BC and lasted over 20 years. Rome entered it with almost no naval experience. Carthage, by contrast, had fleets, sailors, and shipyards refined over generations. Early Roman defeats were expected. What followed was not. Rome responded by building its own navy almost from scratch. Archaeological evidence and ancient sources describe how Roman shipbuilders copied captured Carthaginian vessels and trained crews rapidly. They even invented new boarding devices to turn sea battles into something closer to land combat, where Roman soldiers excelled. The war dragged on, marked by massive losses on both sides. Ships sank in storms. Fleets were rebuilt and destroyed again. What mattered most was Rome's ability to persist. The Republic could raise new armies and new fleets repeatedly. Carthage struggled to do the same without overextending its economy. In 241 BC, Carthage sued for peace. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Republic had taken its first step toward empire. Peace did not bring stability. Carthage lost territory and wealth, but not ambition. Over the next decades, it expanded its influence in Iberia, building new power bases and armies. Rome watched closely. Tension grew again, this time around a single figure who would become one of history's most studied commanders, Hannibal. In 218 BC, Hannibal made a decision that shocked the ancient world. Instead of fighting Rome by sea, he marched his army from Iberia, across southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy itself. The journey cost him many men, but what remained was enough. For over a decade, Hannibal moved through Italy, defeating Roman armies again and again. Battles like Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae exposed weaknesses in Rome's command and coordination. At Cannae alone, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. Yet Rome did not surrender. This was the turning point of the Punic Wars. Despite devastating losses, the Republic refused to negotiate. It avoided direct confrontation, shadowed Hannibal's movements, and focused on cutting off his support. Meanwhile, Roman forces attacked Carthaginian holdings elsewhere, including Iberia and North Africa. This strategy took time, but it worked. Rome slowly regained control. Hannibal, far from home, could not replace his losses. Eventually, Roman general Scipio Africanus carried the war directly to Carthage's territory. In 202 BC, Hannibal was recalled to defend his homeland. At the Battle of Zama, he was defeated. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage stripped of its military power and independence. Rome emerged victorious, but changed. The scale of warfare had expanded beyond anything the Republic had faced before. Wealth poured in from conquered lands. Slaves arrived in huge numbers. Generals returned as heroes with loyal armies behind them. The balance between civilian authority and military power began to shift. The Third Punic War, decades later, was less a contest and more an execution. Rome, fearing Carthage's recovery, laid siege to the city. In 146 BC, Carthage was destroyed. Its population was killed or enslaved. The city was burned. Rome stood alone as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. Victory came at a cost. The Punic Wars created an empire, but they also planted deep internal tensions. Inequality increased. Political violence became more common. Rome had defeated its greatest external rival, but it had also reshaped itself in ways it did not yet fully understand. Chapter 6. The Republic breaks. By the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic looked stronger than ever on the outside. It ruled vast territories, controlled trade routes, and had no serious rivals in the Mediterranean. But beneath that surface, the system that had once balanced power was beginning to strain. The Republic had been designed to govern a city and its nearby lands. It was now trying to govern an empire, and the old rules were no longer enough. One of the first cracks appeared in the countryside. Years of constant warfare had kept citizen soldiers away from their farms. Many returned home to find their land damaged, seized, or bought cheaply by wealthy elites. Large estates, worked by enslaved people captured in Rome's wars, replaced small family farms. This shift increased food production for profit, but it also pushed thousands of Roman citizens into poverty. They drifted toward the city, where jobs were scarce and frustration was high. The political system struggled to respond. The Senate was dominated by elite families who benefited from the status quo. Reform was slow and resistance was strong. Into this tension stepped two brothers whose names would echo through Roman history, Tiberius Gracchus and later Gaius Gracchus. Both served as tribunes of the people and pushed for land reforms aimed at restoring small farms to citizens. Tiberius proposed limits on how much public land any one person could hold. The idea was not radical by Roman law, but enforcing it threatened powerful interests. Opposition grew fierce. Debates turned violent. In 133 BC, Tiberius was killed along with hundreds of his supporters. It was a turning point. Political murder, once rare, became possible again. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus expanded the reform agenda. He pushed for grain subsidies, legal protections, and broader citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies. His vision was larger and more systematic, but the backlash was stronger too. In 121 BC, Gaius met the same fate as his brother. Violence had entered Roman politics, and it would not leave. As reform failed, ambition filled the vacuum. Military commanders began to matter more than institutions. The army itself changed. Traditionally, soldiers were landowning citizens who served temporarily. Now, generals recruited the poor, offering pay, loot, and the promise of land after service. Loyalty shifted from the state to the commander. This was a quiet revolution, and it made the Republic fragile. One of the first to exploit this shift was Marius, a general who reformed the army and won major victories. His rival, Sulla, took things further. In 88 BC, Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, something no Roman leader had ever done before. He seized control, declared himself dictator, and used violence and executions to eliminate enemies. Though he eventually stepped down, the precedent was set. Armies could now decide politics. The Republic survived Sulla, but only barely. The cycle of civil conflict continued. Powerful men formed alliances to bypass traditional checks. The most famous of these was the First Triumvirate, an informal agreement between three ambitious figures, including Julius Caesar. Caesar's rise was rapid. His military campaigns brought him fame, wealth, and loyal legions. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC, he made a clear statement. He chose war over compromise. The civil war that followed shattered any remaining illusion of republican stability. Caesar emerged victorious and was named dictator for life. He enacted reforms, but power was now concentrated in one man. His assassination in 44 BC was meant to save the republic. Instead, it destroyed it. More civil wars followed. The institutions remained, but they were hollow. Authority no longer flowed from law and tradition, but from force. What broke the republic was not a single moment, but a pattern. Economic inequality, political violence, and military loyalty combined to undermine the system from within. The republic could not adapt fast enough to the world it had created. By the end of this period, Rome was exhausted by conflict and ready for something new, even if it meant surrendering old ideals. Chapter 7: The Rise of Empire. When the civil wars finally slowed, Rome was tired. Decades of violence had taught its people a hard lesson. The republic's old system, once built to prevent tyranny, could no longer control ambition or protect stability. What Romans wanted most now was not freedom in the abstract, but order. Into this moment stepped one man who understood that desire better than anyone else. His name was Gaius Octavius. History would remember him as Augustus. Octavius was young, sickly, and inexperienced when he first entered Roman politics. He was also Julius Caesar's adopted heir. After Caesar's assassination, many underestimated him. That mistake would define the next phase of Roman history. Instead of presenting himself as another dictator, Octavius moved carefully. He learned from Caesar's fate. Power, he realized, had to be disguised. The years after Caesar's death were chaotic. Rome fell back into civil war as rival factions fought for control. Octavius formed an uneasy alliance with Mark Antony and Lepidus, known as the Second Triumvirate. Together, they defeated Caesar's assassins. But alliances built on convenience do not last. Tension between Octavius and Antony grew, especially as Antony's relationship with Cleopatra of Egypt pulled him further from Rome. The final break came in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium. Octavius's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra in a naval battle off the coast of Greece. The victory was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra later took their own lives. Egypt was absorbed into Roman control. Octavius stood alone at the top of the Roman world. What came next was the most delicate political performance in Roman history. Octavius did not declare himself king. He did not abolish the Senate. Instead, in 27 BC, he claimed to restore the Republic. He returned powers to traditional institutions, at least on paper. In response, the Senate granted him special honors and authority. They gave him a new name, Augustus. The title mattered. Augustus carried religious and moral weight, not political aggression. It suggested reverence, not domination. From that moment on, Rome had an emperor without admitting it. Augustus held multiple roles at once. He controlled the army, he influenced the Senate, he shaped law, religion, and public life. But he framed all of this as service. He called himself first citizen, not ruler. This careful balance allowed Romans to accept imperial rule without feeling they had betrayed their past. Under Augustus, Rome entered a period of relative stability, later known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. Wars did not disappear, but large-scale internal conflict faded. Roads expanded, trade increased, cities grew, art and literature flourished. Augustus invested heavily in public works, temples, and infrastructure. He famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Control of the military was central to this stability. Augustus reduced the number of legions and placed them under imperial command. Soldiers swore loyalty to him personally. Veterans were settled on land, reducing unrest. This professional army no longer served the Republic. It served the emperor. Religion was also reshaped. Augustus promoted traditional Roman values: family, duty, and respect for the gods. He restored old temples and revived ancient rituals. At the same time, he subtly encouraged loyalty to himself as part of Rome's moral order. His image appeared on coins across the empire. His story was told in poetry and monuments. Rome was being unified not just by force, but by narrative. Yet this new system had limits. Succession was never clearly defined. Augustus had no biological son. Choosing an heir became a quiet but serious problem. He adopted relatives, elevated them, and watched many die before him. The empire rested on one man's authority, and everyone knew it. When Augustus died in AD 14, Rome held its breath. The transition of power would test whether this system could survive beyond its founder. The Senate confirmed his chosen heir, Tiberius, and the empire continued. The experiment had worked, at least for now. The rise of empire was not a sudden collapse of the republic, but a gradual surrender to reality. Romans traded shared power for stability. They accepted one ruler in exchange for peace. It was a decision shaped by exhaustion as much as ambition. By the time Augustus was gone, Rome had changed forever. The language of the republic remained, but its spirit had moved on. A new era had begun, one defined by emperors, provinces, and a world bound together under Roman rule. Chapter 8: Life inside the empire. At its height, the Roman Empire was less a single place than a vast web of lives stretching from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the edge of the Sahara. To understand Rome's power, it helps to step away from emperors and armies and look at ordinary days. How people worked, worshipped, ate, and moved through the world tells us more about the empire's strength and its limits than any battle ever could. Life looked very different depending on where someone lived, but the empire tried to create a shared rhythm. Cities were the heart of that effort. Across the provinces, Roman-style towns appeared with familiar features: paved streets, public baths, temples, forums, and theaters. Even far from Italy, a traveler could recognize a Roman city by its layout and routines. This was not accidental. Urban life helped spread Roman customs and kept distant regions connected to the center. In the city of Rome itself, daily life was crowded and loud. More than 1 million people may have lived there at its peak. Most were not wealthy. Many lived in tall apartment buildings called insulae, built quickly and often poorly. Fires were common. Water had to be carried upstairs. Privacy was rare. Yet the city also offered opportunities. Grain distributions helped prevent starvation. Public baths provided not just cleanliness, but social life. Forums were places to hear news, argue politics, and seek favors. The baths deserve special attention because they show how Roman life blended practicality with pleasure. For a small fee, or sometimes free, people of different classes could bathe, exercise, and talk. The baths were warm, busy, and social. Business deals were discussed there. Friendships formed there. Even politics found its way into the steam-filled rooms. Cleanliness mattered, but connection mattered more. Outside the cities, rural life continued much as it always had. Farmers worked land that had often been in their families for generations, though ownership was increasingly unequal. Large estates produced grain, olives, and wine for distant markets. Slavery was central to this system. Enslaved people worked fields, mines, workshops, and homes. Their labor supported the empire's economy, but their lives were controlled and often brutal. Rome depended on slavery, and that dependence shaped everything from wealth to social attitudes. Trade bound the empire together. Roman roads were among the most enduring tools of control. They allowed soldiers, officials, and merchants to move efficiently. Goods traveled vast distances. Olive oil from Spain, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, spices from the East, all flowed through ports and markets. Coins carried the emperor's image, reinforcing authority with every transaction. Shrines stood beside grand temples. Rituals marked births, marriages, and deaths. What mattered most was practice, not belief. Performing the correct rites helped maintain order between humans and the divine. Over time, new religious movements spread along the same roads as trade. Mystery cults promised personal salvation. Eastern religions brought new ideas about the afterlife. Among these movements was Christianity, which began as a small Jewish sect and slowly expanded. At first, it was one belief among many. Its growth would matter later, but during much of the empire's height, it was just another quiet presence in a crowd. Religion was everywhere, woven into daily routine. Romans did not usually seek exclusive belief. They honored many gods, often adopting local deities into Roman forms. Household ed spiritual world. Entertainment played a powerful role in shaping loyalty. Theaters, chariot races, and gladiator games drew huge crowds. These events were not just distractions. They were political tools. Emperors and local elites sponsored games to gain favor. Public spectacle reminded people who provided stability and generosity. Violence was normalized in these settings, but it was also controlled and ritualized. Family life varied across regions and classes. Roman law gave fathers significant authority, but practice was often more flexible. Women managed households, ran businesses, and participated in religious life, even if they lacked formal political power. Children were expected to learn obedience early. Education mattered most for the elite, but basic literacy was more widespread than often assumed. One of the most revealing windows into everyday Roman life comes from places frozen in time, such as Pompeii. Its preserved streets, homes, and graffiti show humor, frustration, love, and ambition. They remind us that Romans were not distant figures carved in stone. They worried about money. They complained about neighbors. They celebrated victories and mourned losses. For all its reach, the empire was never uniform. Local customs persisted. Languages survived. Roman rule adapted rather than erased. This flexibility helped maintain control, but it also meant unity was fragile. Beneath the shared surface, differences remained. Life inside the empire was full, structured, and often harsh. It offered stability, but demanded conformity. For many, Rome brought order and opportunity. For others, it brought exploitation and loss. Both truths existed at the same time. As long as the system held, these tensions were manageable. But systems age, pressures build quietly, and in time, the balance that sustained daily life across the empire would begin to shift. Chapter 9: Crisis, Division, and Change. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was no longer moving forward with confidence. It was holding itself together. For generations, Rome had relied on expansion, wealth from conquest, and a steady flow of resources to keep its system balanced. When that expansion slowed, the weaknesses that had always existed became harder to ignore. The crisis did not arrive all at once. It crept in through many doors. Along the frontiers, pressure increased as rival groups tested Rome's borders. In the east, a revived Persian power challenged Roman authority. In the north, raids became more frequent. Defending such vast borders required constant military presence, and that strained both manpower and finances. Armies needed pay. Fortifications needed repair. Roads and cities needed maintenance. The cost of empire was rising. Inside the empire, political instability made everything worse. Emperors came and went at alarming speed. Some ruled for only months before being killed by rivals or their own soldiers. Loyalty was no longer to Rome as an idea, but to whoever could provide pay and protection. This period is often called the crisis of the 3rd century, and it lived up to the name. The empire fractured. Breakaway states formed in the west and east, claiming Roman identity but ruling independently. Economic stress followed political chaos. Coinage was debased as emperors tried to stretch limited resources. Inflation rose. Trade slowed in some regions. Cities that once thrived on long-distance commerce struggled to adapt. Rural areas became more self-sufficient, less connected to imperial markets. The empire was still vast, but it was less integrated. One response to this breakdown came from a soldier emperor named Diocletian. When he took power in AD 284, his goal was not to restore the old empire, but to reshape it into something more manageable. Diocletian believed that no single person could govern such a large territory alone. His solution was division, not collapse. He split authority between multiple rulers in a system known as the Tetrarchy. The empire was divided into eastern and western halves, each ruled by a senior and junior emperor. Power became more regional. Administration became more direct. Taxes were reorganized. The army was restructured. These reforms brought short-term stability, but they also marked a turning point. The empire was no longer pretending to be unified in the old sense. Diocletian also changed how emperors presented themselves. Gone was the image of the first citizen. Emperors now ruled with distance and ceremony. Court rituals emphasized hierarchy and control. The gap between ruler and subject widened. This shift reflected reality. Authority now relied more on command than consent. Religion, too, became a point of tension. Diocletian attempted to reinforce traditional Roman worship as a way to restore unity. This included persecution of groups seen as refusing participation, most notably Christians. These efforts failed to restore religious uniformity, but they revealed how deeply belief had become tied to political stability. After Diocletian, the empire did not return to chaos, but it did not fully heal either. The system held, but only through constant adjustment. One of the most important figures to inherit this changing world was Constantine the Great. His rise would reshape Rome in ways few could have imagined. Constantine emerged from civil war as the sole ruler of the empire in the early 4th century. Like Diocletian, he understood that old forms no longer worked, but his solutions went further. One of his most significant decisions was religious. He ended official persecution of Christians and eventually favored Christianity within the imperial system. This was not an overnight transformation, but it marked a profound shift. For the first time, the empire aligned itself with a faith that had once been marginal. Constantine also made a decision that symbolized the empire's changing center of gravity. He founded a new capital in the east, on the site of an old Greek city, and named it Constantinople. Strategically placed and heavily fortified, it reflected where power now truly lay. The eastern provinces were wealthier, more urbanized, and easier to defend. Rome, the old capital, remained important symbolically, but it was no longer the heart of imperial rule. This shift did not mean immediate decline. In many ways, the Eastern Empire entered a new phase of strength. Administration became more efficient. Trade routes remained active. Culture adapted. But the division between East and West deepened. The two halves faced different pressures and developed different responses. Change became the empire's defining feature. Political structures evolved. Religious identity transformed. Power relocated. Rome was still Rome, but it was no longer the empire of Augustus or Trajan. It was something new, shaped by survival rather than expansion. These transformations kept the empire alive, but they also altered its character forever. The world Rome had created was changing, and not all parts would endure equally. Chapter 10: The Long Fall of Rome. The fall of Rome is often imagined as a single dramatic moment, but the reality was far slower and quieter. It unfolded over centuries, shaped by pressure, adaptation, and uneven survival. What disappeared was not Roman culture itself, but Roman control in the West. What endured was a transformed version of Rome that lived on in the East. By the late 4th century, the western half of the empire was struggling to hold itself together. Its cities were smaller, its economy weaker, and its borders harder to defend. Power shifted constantly between emperors, generals, and regional leaders. Many emperors ruled briefly, often placed on the throne by the army, and removed just as quickly. Authority existed, but it was fragile. One of the most visible pressures came from beyond the empire's borders. Groups that Romans labeled as barbarians had long interacted with the empire through trade, warfare, and settlement. These groups were not outsiders in the simple sense. Many served in Roman armies. Some had lived within imperial borders for generations. But as Rome's ability to manage its frontiers weakened, these relationships changed. In 410 AD, the city of Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths. It was a symbolic shock more than a military disaster. Rome was no longer the political capital, but it remained the emotional heart of the empire. For centuries, Romans believed the city was protected by fate. Seeing it breached shattered that confidence. Contemporary writers described fear and confusion, but also resilience. Life continued. The empire did not end. Over the next decades, Western emperors increasingly relied on non-Roman military leaders to defend territory. These generals held real power, while emperors became figureheads. In some regions, Roman administration faded, and local rulers stepped in to maintain order. Laws were still issued in the emperor's name, but enforcement depended on who controlled the land. The final break came in 476 AD, when the last Western emperor was removed from office. No dramatic collapse followed. There was no official declaration of the empire's end. Instead, authority quietly shifted. Roman institutions dissolved or were absorbed into new kingdoms. Roman law, language and culture remained, but the centralized state was gone. What fell was a political structure, not a civilization. While the West fragmented, the eastern half of the empire followed a different path. Centered on Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire adapted. Its cities remained active. Its economy stayed connected to major trade routes. Its bureaucracy evolved rather than collapsed. Greek gradually replaced Latin as the main administrative language, but Roman identity persisted. Eastern emperors continued to call themselves Roman. They preserved imperial titles, legal traditions, and state religion. Under rulers like Justinian I, there were even attempts to reclaim lost Western territories. Some of these campaigns succeeded briefly, but they stretched resources thin. The Eastern Empire survived not through reconquest, but through flexibility. Religion played a key role in this survival. Christianity, now deeply embedded in imperial identity, helped unify populations and legitimize authority. The church preserved texts, law, and learning during periods of instability. Bishops became local leaders where imperial officials could not reach. Faith did not replace Rome, but it carried parts of Rome forward. Over time, the Eastern Empire became something historians would later call Byzantine, though its people never used that name. To them, Rome had not fallen. It had changed language, customs, and borders, but it still existed. This continuity is easy to overlook when focusing only on the West. The long fall of Rome challenges simple endings. There was no single cause, no final battle that explains everything. Economic strain, political instability, military pressure, and administrative overreach all played roles. But adaptation mattered just as much. Rome survived where it could adjust and failed where it could not. Even in the West, Rome did not vanish. Roman law shaped medieval legal systems. Roman roads guided travel for centuries. Latin evolved into modern languages. The idea of empire influenced rulers long after the emperors were gone. Rome lived on as memory, structure, and ambition. The story of Rome's fall is not about decay alone. It is about transformation. An ancient world gave way to a new one, carrying fragments of the old forward. In that sense, Rome never truly ended. It became the foundation for what came next.